And for more on this, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Teng Jianqun with us here in Beijing, and also with Mr. Leonard Boyle, who is a spokesperson for the UN's International Organization for Migration, and he's now based in Geneva, Switzerland. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. First of all, Mr. Doyle, what do you make of the change of attitude coming from the European countries at the very beginning? Hesitation of accepting the refugees, and then embracing the refugees, and now the attitudes have shifted again. What do you make of these attitudes shift? We are not hearing any voices coming from our panelists in Switzerland. So let me go to you, Mr. Tang. Coming as an observer for the situation, what do you make about the latest development of refugees inside Europe coming from Syria?
This is really a humanitarian disaster, not only for the Middle East countries, but also for the European countries. As we all know, the European country, for most of the European countries, are now suffering the financial crisis, and this time the refugee crisis again gave another attack on the peaceful development in the European countries and the recovery of the financial crisis. So this is actually a disaster for all the countries concerned, in my opinion.
But then many would say, what does it mean for the international community? Obviously, this is a gigantic task. Not only for the European countries, but also for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And now we see a lot of debates inside Europe, but what about outside Europe? From China's perspective, China is one member of the P5s, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. So what could be the ultimate solution for this?
I think the international community should learn lessons from this disaster. Actually, the military intervention by the United States and other Western countries did give very negative impact on the situation in the Middle East and also in Europe. For example, the refugees, a lot of refugees actually, have to leave their hometown to go somewhere for the safe and secure environment of life. This is actually a disaster from the United States, and the potential Republican candidate Trump recently said in the interview, he mentioned that if Saddam was in position, if Gaddafi was in position, the situation in the Middle East would be much better.
But of course, he's not necessarily being taken for his words as a candidate. So what, final first from you before we go to the other panelists, what does it mean for China and others at the UN Security Council? Is there some kind of solution besides just let the European countries shoulder the responsibility of accept as many refugees as possible?
Actually started from 2003. We have witnessed the military intervention without the permission from the UN Security Council. This is actually a very special phenomenon we are facing now. How can military intervention play its real role in making peace and stability in some regions? Some countries just preferred to use military intervention for their own sake. For example, the so-called big democracy in the Middle East by the United States. Actually, this is a very bad plan from the United States, which completely destroy the structure, the power structure in that region. And now today, no country can say it can control the whole country.
Well, let me go to you, Mr. Leonard Doyle. I understand from my colleague that we are fine with the sound. So let me go to you. What do you make of the shifts, as I asked you earlier, of attitude coming from European countries toward the refugees coming from Syria and Iraq?
Well, I think it's telling us an important story. The European leadership has been almost ostrich-like, with its head in the sand for a long time, in the face of many people crossing the Mediterranean and many, many people suffering and dying, including young children and women. So it took several tragedies with large numbers of people, 700 people at a time, dying before the European leadership began to react. And as you rightly said, it took the death of that young boy, the photograph of that young boy on the beach, to galvanize international opinion. So what we've found, I think, is that public opinion in Europe is ahead of the political leadership. Of course, there is a problem, as you mentioned earlier, that the European countries, you know, they're all individuals and they all have politicians who are willing to play games with this. So too many refugees, too many migrants could create a backlash.
But also, Mr. Doyle, you probably have noticed that public opinion is not as something just similar to one another. In fact, public opinion, even inside European countries, are pretty much divided. And it depends on which country you do your survey in when it comes to the attitude toward the refugees. So really, public opinion likely to change the policy? One boy's photo likely to change the overall attitude toward the refugees?
Well, we saw that the Europeans got rid of their life-saving method, which was called Mare Nostrum, which had been saving hundreds of thousands of lives, in a misguided effort because they thought it was attracting refugees. So this was a political decision, let's get rid of Mare Nostrum. It took one disaster in which 700 people died for the European leadership to realize that ordinary people will not support a situation where hundreds of people are dying every month, every week. So as a direct result of that, they had a U-turn and they reinstituted the naval rescue mission. And indeed today we have more news that they're now going to enable the rescue mission to go after the smugglers directly. So you can see here how public opinion will not tolerate death on this scale within sight of European beaches where people are on vacation, to put it crudely.
And let me go to you. We are now also connected to Ms. Dawn Chatty, who is a professor at University of Oxford. She also served earlier as former director of the Refugee Studies Center. Ms. Chatty, let me ask you this question. We see different opinions inside the European countries, even between Germany and France. These kind of different opinions, is it likely to create a competition of the volume of support for the refugees, or is it actually going to reduce the efforts and enthusiasm for the work for the refugees?
I think what you're seeing now is France and Germany understanding the need of living up to their international obligations to provide refuge and asylum for people fleeing armed conflict. As the speaker mentioned earlier, the Mare Nostrum program was set up by the Italian government and funded entirely by the Italian government to save people at sea. And it was actually the British politician, Theresa May, when the Italians asked for the EU to come in and share the burden of this kind of rescue mission, she rejected it and encouraged the European countries to reject it on the false premise that rescuing people at sea would only attract more to come. She was completely oblivious to the crisis, which in many ways the European countries, certainly Great Britain and the United States, are culpable of. The crisis that we're seeing in Syria is really an outcome of the original Anglo-American invasion in 2003 of Iraq. But what we're seeing today, and really being led by Germany, is an understanding that we have a moral and ethical obligation to provide rescue, to provide refuge, to provide asylum to these people. And I think this is emerging along with a groundswell of popular opinion to do the same. You see it very clearly in Germany. We've been seeing it now in the United Kingdom and in France. And I am hopeful that some kind of formula will be hammered out, which will provide more assistance, for example, to Turkey. Turkey has been providing very well-designed refugee camps for about 250,000 refugees. And the model that Turkey has used, if it is provided with funding, it could extend it and perhaps in that way slow down the wave of Syrians who are fleeing and who are going to be fleeing now that we have the entry of Russia into the Syrian conflict in Syria.
Ms. Chatty, I can see you now on the big screen, and you can probably also look at the camera now because we can see you pretty clearly now. You can look at the camera. And may I follow up by asking you, in your answer, you also indicated, as our Chinese guest earlier, about the root cause of the problem. The cause originally was because of the military intervention and the wars in Iraq, and also now the civil war inside Syria. But the question is, how should the international responsibilities be divided? Should that be divided into two? Some countries just go to war against other countries and do the military intervention no matter what the results might be, and other countries just try to embrace as many whatever results coming out of these wars as possible. For example, all of these kinds of refugees into the European countries. So what kind of international order this specific event really is leading us to think about at this moment from your view, Ms. Chatty?
Well, I really can't comment on the political negotiations, but clearly Europe and America have a responsibility. The war that we're seeing in Syria, as I said earlier, and as you've reiterated, very much are an outcome of the effort to remove Saddam Hussein from the leadership or dictatorship of Iraq in 2003. And the emergence of Daesh or the ISIS, whatever, this is very, very clearly the direct result of that. However, I think that the international order does have a responsibility, and it can take on that responsibility in some kind of a comprehensive plan. And by this, I'm not just talking some sort of wish list, but I think you'll remember that in 1989, the Western nations agreed to accept 1 million Vietnamese boat people who have been fleeing from Vietnam since the fall of South Vietnam. And 1 million people in a very short period of time were then resettled in Europe, in Canada, in the United States. Canada alone took something like 40,000. What we need now in this particular crisis, with the huge number of refugees fleeing from Syria, which I just want to recall, is a country on the eastern Mediterranean. It's not that far away. It's the neighbor to Europe. We need a comprehensive plan of action to provide temporary protection for these people for the next perhaps 5 years, the next 10 years, until they can return to their country.
Okay.
And in this comprehensive plan of action, I just say one last thing. We need to think about the young people. There will be a lost generation unless we can educate the young people who have been out of education, have been in this critical situation for the last 4 or 5 years.
It's a very comprehensive answer already, but let me go to you, Mr. Doyle. There are new military interventions inside Syria coming from different countries, airstrikes as well, in the name of fighting against ISIS and terrorism. But the question is, will that lead to further escalation of tensions inside the country and even more humanitarian disasters inside that specific country? It seems that the international community is now being dragged to all kinds of directions without really coming to a common consensus, not only about the refugees, but also about the solutions. Ms. Doyle. Mr. Doyle.
Well, I think you point to a very important issue, which is that warfare leads to disturbance and to displacement of people, and in turn that will inevitably lead, no doubt, to more refugees. And also to the bigger issue, which is that we are supposed to be acting as an international community through the Security Council to the permanent 5 members. And unfortunately, in the Syria context, you have them apparently backing different sides. So this cannot help. Military action may help, of course, to push back the terrorism of ISIS or Daesh, but surely if we are backing different sides, it's going to lead to a prolongation of the misery of the civilians of the country. And if I could just comment on some of the remarks I've heard earlier, I mean, it is fashionable to blame the woes of the world on the Europeans and the Americans, and goodness knows they are guilty of many mistakes. But at the end of the day, the problems in Syria, surely most of them must lie at the feet of a very cruel dictatorship and very sectarian politics. I mean, if you cannot bring your people with you, your people will rise against you. This is a lesson that all countries know. And I think we should just look a little bit harder at the actual practice of the ruling regime in failing to bring its country together before we blame everybody else around the world.
All right. A lot of ideological talks. There's also the humanitarian angles to the story. Meanwhile, how the international communities could and should come together. Certainly a very complicated question. Still no answer. And the humanitarian disaster is still going on at the moment. But for now, we want to thank the three of you for sharing your opinions, no matter where you are coming from. We want to thank Leonard Doyle, and also in London, Ms. Dawn Shetty, and in Beijing, Mr. Teng Jianquan. Thank you so much for being with us.